William may never have stood in front of a camera and revealed the truth about what happened to Princess Diana in a single dramatic confession. But over the years, the evidence surrounding his parents' marriage has painted a picture that changes everything he was once expected to believe. Because the story did not begin when Diana met Charles. By then, the most important decision may already have been made. And if William now understands what the palace knew before his mother ever entered that marriage, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Was Diana walking into a love story that failed or into a tragedy that had already begun? Before we uncover what really happened behind the palace doors, subscribe for more deeply researched royal documentaries, because some stories become more disturbing the further back you go. There is one date in the story of Charles and Diana that refuses to sit comfortably inside the version most people grew up believing. For decades, the familiar explanation was simple enough. Charles married Diana, the marriage became unhappy, and his relationship with Camilla deepened as the problems between husband and wife grew worse. But the deeper record complicates that sequence. Charles and Camilla had known each other since the early 70s, and accounts from royal biographers place their renewed relationship before Diana's engagement to Charles. The exact timing has been debated, with different sources placing the reconnection at slightly different points. But the broader direction is difficult to ignore. The emotional attachment between Charles and Camilla did not simply appear because the marriage to Diana had already failed. That changes the question completely. If Charles was already emotionally connected to Camilla before Diana entered the picture, then Diana's tragedy cannot be understood only as the story of a marriage that gradually fell apart. Something existed before she arrived, something she was never fully equipped to understand. And somewhere inside the palace, people had already spent years thinking about what Charles's future was supposed to look like. That does not prove that Diana was deliberately placed into a marriage designed to fail. There is no publicly established document that proves such a conspiracy. But it does raise a far more uncomfortable possibility, that the institution responsible for preparing Charles for his future had already understood the conflict between his private wishes and his public obligations. Diana walked into that conflict without possessing the same information. And that distinction matters, because when she later began questioning what was happening inside her marriage, those around her could dismiss her concerns as insecurity, immaturity, or the difficulty of adjusting to royal life. But what if she was seeing something real? What if the problem she spent years being told she was imagining had existed long before she ever became Princess of Wales? To understand that, we have to look at the young woman who entered the palace believing she was becoming a wife, only to discover that she may have been entering a story whose most important chapter had already been written. Diana entered the royal world believing she was preparing for a marriage. What she could not have known was that she was also stepping into an institution with rules, loyalties, and private histories that existed long before she arrived. She was young, aristocratic, photogenic, and unusually comfortable in front of people. To the outside world, those qualities made her seem almost perfectly suited to become the future queen. But inside the palace, suitability meant something very different from happiness. Diana was 19 when her life suddenly became public property. Around her were staff members who had served the royal household for years, advisors who understood its traditions instinctively, and a future husband whose life had been shaped by expectations she had experienced herself. She was surrounded by people, yet increasingly isolated from honest answers. That isolation became more painful when she began noticing signs that something was missing from her relationship with Charles. There were moments when his attention changed in the presence of certain people. There were names that seemed to carry an unusual weight. There were conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Then came the discovery that made those suspicions impossible to dismiss. Diana found a pair of gold cufflinks associated with Camilla, carrying an intimate significance that immediately raised questions about the man she was preparing to marry. The discovery did not simply create jealousy. It forced Diana to confront a possibility she had not been prepared to face, that Charles's emotional life might already contain a place she could not occupy. She reportedly confronted him privately, and what followed was not the reassurance a frightened young bride might have expected. It was silence. That silence mattered because Diana was perceptive. She may have been inexperienced in royal life, but she was not incapable of reading people. The more she watched, the more she began assembling a picture without anyone inside the institution giving her the complete explanation. The tragedy was not simply that she discovered another woman, it was that she appeared to discover a world of information in which everyone else already understood the rules. Diana was being asked to perform the role of future queen while trying to understand the emotional reality of her own marriage at the same time. And if she had already sensed the truth so early, another question becomes unavoidable. Why did nobody simply tell her what she was walking into? The answer begins with Charles himself, and with the woman the palace had once decided he could never marry. To understand why Diana walked into such a complicated marriage, we have to go back to Charles before he was a husband, before he was a father, and before the public knew Camilla as the woman who would eventually become queen. Charles and Camilla met through the same social world in the early 70s. Those who knew them described a relationship that felt unusually natural. She made him laugh. She could speak to him without treating the title as the most important thing about him. Around her, Charles appeared less constrained by the expectations that followed him everywhere else. But affection was only one part of the equation. Charles was not an ordinary young man choosing a wife. He was the heir to the British throne, and the woman he married would eventually become queen consort. The standards surrounding that role were shaped by a very different generation. Camilla did not fit comfortably inside those expectations. Her background, previous relationships, personality, and independence made her difficult to imagine as the future wife of the heir. The judgment was not necessarily expressed through one dramatic command. It worked more quietly, through advice, expectations, distance, and the accumulated pressure of people who believed they understood what the monarchy required. The message was simple enough. Camilla might be someone Charles could love, but she was not necessarily someone he could marry. Charles entered the Royal Navy, creating physical distance between them. Then, in the early 70s, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. From the perspective of the institution, the problem appeared to have been solved. But this is where the story becomes more revealing. Nobody needed to tell Charles that his feelings had disappeared. Nobody needed to prove that the relationship was permanently over. The circumstances surrounding him had simply changed until the most convenient outcome became the easiest one to accept. That distinction matters because institutions rarely control private lives by issuing obvious orders. Sometimes they control them by narrowing the choices available. Charles eventually returned to the royal world, expected of him. Camilla built a life of her own, and the palace could move forward believing that an uncomfortable chapter had closed. Except it had not. Somewhere beneath the official expectations, the emotional connection remained unresolved. And if that connection really returned before Diana was ever engaged to Charles, then the entire sequence of the story changes. Because Diana was not necessarily the beginning of the problem. She may have been the person who arrived after the problem had already existed, and that is where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the story changes direction. For years, the public inherited a simple sequence. That disagreement matters, because responsible history cannot turn uncertainty into certainty. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had resumed before Diana's engagement. That changes everything. If Charles was already emotionally connected to Camilla before Diana entered the marriage, then Diana was not the person who created the central problem. She entered a situation in which the most important emotional conflict already existed. Suddenly, details that once seemed disconnected begin to look different. The cufflinks are no longer simply evidence of Diana's jealousy. Her growing suspicion no longer looks automatically like youthful insecurity. And her later confrontation with Camilla becomes more painful because Diana was not discovering the beginning of a new relationship. She was confronting a relationship that had survived circumstances designed to end it. This does not prove that palace officials deliberately chose Diana as a solution to Camilla. There is no publicly established document showing such a plan, but it raises a much harder question. What did the people around Charles know before Diana was asked to marry him? Because if senior figures understood that Charles's attachment to Camilla had never truly disappeared, then Diana may have entered the marriage without the information she needed to make an informed choice. And that is the moment the story stops being only about two women and one man. It becomes a story about an institution that had spent years deciding what Charles could and could not do with his private life. And if those people already understood the problem, then the next question is the most uncomfortable one of all. Did they believe Diana could survive it? The most uncomfortable part of this story begins when we stop asking what Charles wanted and start asking what the institution around him needed. The monarchy was never designed simply to protect the private happiness of one man. Its advisors were thinking about continuity, public confidence, succession, and the stability of an institution that had survived precisely because personal desires were expected to come second. That does not make those advisors villains. In their own minds, they may have believed they were protecting something larger than any individual marriage. But that is exactly what makes the situation so difficult. If senior figures understood how deeply Charles remained attached to Camilla, then choosing a future wife was not simply a romantic decision. It was an institutional calculation. Diana's youth, family background, public appeal, and apparent suitability made her an attractive candidate for a role the palace desperately needed filled. What remains uncertain is how much of the private reality was explained to her. There is no proven document showing that officials deliberately deceived Diana or knowingly placed her into an impossible marriage. That distinction matters. But the accounts that emerge from royal biographies suggest that Charles's attachment to Camilla was not some hidden surprise that suddenly appeared after the wedding. People close to the prince understood the history. They understood the difficulty, and they understood that marriage might not erase feelings that had survived separation. That creates a profound imbalance. Charles entered the marriage carrying knowledge of his own emotional history. The institution around him carried knowledge of its expectations. Diana entered carrying almost none of that internal map. She was expected to become part of the system before she fully understood how the system worked. And perhaps the palace believed that duty would eventually solve what emotion could not. That assumption may explain why so many people around Diana could respond to her concerns with sympathy without giving her the one thing she actually needed: a completely honest explanation. They could comfort her, they could advise her, they could tell her to adjust, but none of that answered the central question she was quietly asking. If they knew Charles's heart was elsewhere, who was responsible for protecting hers? The answer would emerge slowly through Diana's increasingly public struggle with the institution itself. And once that struggle began, the palace could no longer treat her as simply a young bride learning her place. Diana eventually reached a point where silence was no longer protecting her. The tensions inside her marriage had become impossible to contain, and the more she tried to establish her own voice, the more distant she became from the institution around her. Her cooperation with Andrew Morton's biography marked a decisive turning point. Through recorded conversations, Diana helped create an account of her marriage that challenged the carefully controlled public image surrounding Charles and the royal household. The palace could manage schedules, statements, appearances, and headlines, but it could not easily manage Diana speaking for herself. Her official position changed. Her relationship with the royal machinery became increasingly distant. What had once been a private marital crisis was becoming an institutional conflict. Then came the Panorama interview. Millions watched Diana speak openly about her marriage and Charles's relationship with another woman. The broadcast became one of the most consequential moments in modern royal history. But there is an important distinction. The methods used by Martin Bashir to obtain the interview were later condemned by the BBC's Dyson investigation. Bashir had used deception and false documents, and the BBC eventually apologized. That was deeply serious. But it does not automatically answer another question: whether everything Diana said during the interview was therefore false. Those are two separate issues. Diana had spent years being told, directly and indirectly, that her concerns were personal instability, jealousy, or difficulty adapting to royal life. Now she was presenting her own version of events to the public. The institution could no longer control the story simply by refusing to discuss it. Diana had become an independent source of information, and that changed the stakes completely, because the audience watching her was not limited to millions of strangers. Her sons were watching too. William was still young enough to feel the consequences of his parents' conflict, but too young to understand the machinery behind it. Years later, that distinction would become crucial. He would not simply remember what his mother had suffered. He would begin asking why she had been placed in a position where suffering became almost inevitable. And that question would follow him long after Diana was gone. William was 15 when his mother died, old enough to understand that she was gone and young enough to have no control over what happened next. The funeral became one of the defining images of his life. He walked behind Diana's coffin through central London while millions watched, surrounded by adults who had already decided what the public story would be. But William carried something the public could not see. He knew the family had been unhappy. He knew his parents had struggled. He knew his mother had spoken publicly about her pain. What he did not yet possess was the full explanation for why those circumstances had existed in the first place. That understanding came slowly. As William grew older, he built his own life. He went to university, served in the military, married, and became a father. His relationship with Charles also developed into something more complicated than simple resentment. There was genuine affection between them. That matters because it prevents the story from becoming too easy. William did not need to hate his father in order to understand his mother's suffering. He could recognize that Charles had been shaped by the same institution that had shaped Diana's life. Charles had inherited expectations long before he inherited a crown. The more William learned about the past through biographies, accounts from former royal insiders, and the public record, the more complicated the old explanation became. The question was no longer simply whether Charles had made mistakes. It was whether the institution had created circumstances in which almost everyone involved was making choices inside a structure they did not control. That realization would have been particularly difficult for William because he was not destined to leave that structure. He was preparing to inherit it, and there is a profound difference between inheriting an institution you trust and inheriting one whose failures you understand intimately. William could accept Charles as his father. He could respect the monarchy. He could even understand why people inside the palace believed they were protecting the crown. But understanding those things did not erase what happened to Diana. And somewhere between love for his father and loyalty to his mother's memory sat a question that had never received a satisfactory answer. If the institution knew more than Diana did, what responsibility did it carry for what happened to her? William would eventually have to answer that question not as a grieving son, but as the future king. The most striking reversal in this entire story is not that Charles remained attached to Camilla. It is that the institution that once considered her unsuitable eventually accepted her completely. The transformation did not happen overnight. There was no single announcement that suddenly erased decades of public hostility. Instead, Charles and Camilla gradually became a familiar presence within royal life. They appeared together more often. Their public roles expanded. Their charitable work gave audiences opportunities to see Camilla outside the old narrative. Slowly, the image of the woman who had once been blamed for destroying Charles and Diana's marriage began to change. Time did what argument could not. The public did not have to be convinced in one dramatic moment. It simply became accustomed to seeing Camilla beside Charles. Then came their marriage in 2005. By that point, the woman once considered unsuitable had become Charles's wife, and the deeper irony was impossible to miss. The palace had once operated within a system of expectations that made Camilla seem unacceptable as the future queen. Yet decades later, many of those assumptions had quietly lost their power. That does not mean every earlier decision was wrong. It does, however, raise an uncomfortable question about the standards themselves. If Camilla could eventually perform the role successfully, what exactly had made her unsuitable when Charles was young? Was it really her character? Or was it the expectations of a particular generation of royal advisors? Camilla's eventual acceptance also changes how Diana's story can be understood. Diana was not simply replaced by another woman. She became part of a much larger institutional contradiction. The woman who had once been considered impossible eventually became indispensable to the king. The woman chosen to fit the institution became the person who exposed its deepest tensions. And the man caught between them eventually received the outcome he had wanted for decades. But there was one person who had to watch that transformation from inside the institution. William. He had seen his mother become an icon. He had watched his father rebuild his life. And now he was watching Camilla move from the margins of the royal family toward its very center. The final test would not come through another interview or another scandal. It would come through a ceremony where every symbol of the monarchy would be placed in full view. And William would be standing there to witness it. The coronation of King Charles III was designed to represent continuity. Every movement, every seat, every word had been considered long before the ceremony began. And at the center of it stood Camilla. The woman once considered unsuitable to become Charles's wife was now being crowned queen beside him. For William, That moment carried a history the ceremony itself could not acknowledge. He performed his role exactly as expected. He was composed, precise, respectful, and fully aware that millions were watching. Nothing in his behavior publicly challenged the occasion, but that restraint was part of what made the moment so powerful. Because Diana was absent, there was no formal confrontation between past and present, no speech explaining what had happened decades earlier, no public acknowledgement of the private conflict that had shaped William's childhood. The ceremony simply moved forward. Camilla stood beside Charles. William stood within the institution he would eventually inherit, and Diana remained part of the story through absence alone. That is what makes the symbolism so difficult to escape. The monarchy had survived everything that once appeared capable of damaging it. Charles had eventually married the woman he had loved. Camilla had endured years of hostility and reached the highest position available to a royal wife. The institution had adapted, but William had to stand inside that adaptation while carrying the memory of the woman whose life had been transformed by the earlier rules. It would be easy to look at a photograph from the coronation and search William's face for an answer. But expressions cannot prove private thoughts. Whatever he felt, he kept it private. And perhaps that is the lesson he learned from both of his parents. His mother had spoken openly and paid an enormous personal price. His father had endured decades of silence and eventually received the outcome he wanted. William inherited both examples. He also inherited the responsibility of deciding what kind of institution he would lead. The coronation, therefore, became more than a celebration of Charles. It became a quiet preview of William's future. He was not simply watching his father receive the crown. He was watching the system he would one day inherit reveal what it valued most: continuity, restraint, and survival. And when the ceremony ended, one question remained. Could William preserve that institution without repeating the choices that once caused his family so much pain? In the end, this story is not simply about Charles, Diana, or Camilla. It is about William and what happens when a son grows old enough to understand the forces that shaped his parents. Charles eventually got the life he had wanted. Camilla became his wife, and, decades later, queen. The institution that once considered their relationship unsuitable eventually absorbed it completely. Diana received no such second chapter. She remains fixed in public memory at 36, forever associated with the marriage that made her famous and the institution that she eventually challenged. Whatever mistakes she made, whatever difficult decisions she took, she became permanently separated from the royal future she once represented. William inherited something more complicated. He inherited his father's position, but also his mother's memory. He inherited an institution capable of surviving enormous personal upheaval, but he also inherited the knowledge that survival and justice are not always the same thing. That distinction may shape the kind of king he becomes. William does not have to condemn Charles to understand Diana. He does not have to reject the monarchy to recognize its failures. And he does not have to choose between loving his father and protecting his mother's memory. His real challenge is accepting all of those truths at once. The deepest lesson of his parents' story may be that institutions rarely experience consequences in the same way individuals do. The monarchy survived. Charles survived. Camilla survived. Diana did not. And William is the person left to carry all three histories forward. That is why the original question matters so much. The tragedy was not simply that Charles and Diana were incompatible. The more uncomfortable possibility is that their marriage was built around expectations created before Diana fully understood the emotional reality she was entering. There was no need to invent a secret conspiracy to make that disturbing. Sometimes the most consequential decisions are made by people who sincerely believe they are protecting something important. The palace may have believed it was protecting the crown. Charles may have believed he was fulfilling his duty. Camilla may simply have waited for circumstances to change. And Diana may have spent years trying to understand a story whose beginning had never been properly explained to her. William now stands on the other side of that history. One day, the institution will be his. And perhaps the greatest thing he inherits from Diana is not her image, her popularity, or even her memory. It is the knowledge that the crown can survive almost anything. But the people asked to protect it cannot always do so without paying the price. Diana was never simply the woman who lost a marriage. She was the woman who entered a story already written around her. and William may be the first heir forced to inherit not only the crown, but the truth about who wrote it.